I'd like to talk about trauma, I'd like to talk about PTSD and grief. Can someone who is experiencing grief, can it lead to PTSD? I'd like to ask that question. I'd like to share some of my experiences of some of the symptoms that are present within PTSD. But before we do that, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Ghazala at the Heart and Soul Cafe. If you've been here before, thank you so much for coming back again. I'm so pleased that you are here. And if you've come for the first time, pull up a chair and let's talk. Okay. So PTSD. In a previous video, I talked about my experiences after losing my son, of trauma, of how it sort of manifested in me, and the kind of symptoms that I experienced. I talked about having flashbacks. So I was back in our local park, and that's where I very sadly lost my son. He had a very sudden cardiac arrest. There's certain things, for example, I shared that, the smell of grass, the smell of soil, which were sort of all over my tracksuit bottoms at that day when we were out for a walk. Things like that will trigger and take me back to that time, take me back to our local park, in memory, in thought. Okay. The thing is that when I experienced those symptoms, it lasted for a certain period of time with a lot of sort of intensity, to the extent where I became tearful. It had a physical sort of response, meaning that I went into a fight or flight, and I've talked about that before in previous videos, where I have, my heartbeat's gone fast. I might feel sweaty. I might feel shaky slightly, because I'm back there again. I'm back in that situation where my son sadly, fallen to the ground, and and I'm frantically trying to resuscitate him and deal with that situation as best as I possibly could. As I said, the intensity of those feelings, of those flashbacks, were quite impactful in the beginning. So for the first few weeks, for the first couple of months, quite vivid and quite impactful. As time went on, they became a little less severe, if you like, a little less intrusive, possibly might be a better word. So I was able to be mindful about that. That's what my mind is doing. That's what my brain is doing. I'm going back again to that time, and that's my body's way of processing that, and maybe trying to even put things together for me and make it easier for me possibly to digest, because something like that isn't easy to make any sense of. And so it's an ongoing process, really. And I still, to this day, still have, and it's 4 years on, still have flashbacks, still back in that park, still back in that situation. But it doesn't send me into, physically, it doesn't send me into that state that I was in the first few months after experiencing my loss. Okay. So if we talk about PTSD, PTSD is a mental health condition, okay? And grief is a natural response to the loss of something or someone. Okay, so it's a natural thing. It's not a mental health condition. But the thing is that when we're experiencing grief, depending on how we're receiving it, how we're processing it, how we're not processing it, whatever the situation may be, it can lead to PTSD. So if my symptoms had carried on, let's say, and been, as intrusive as they were from soon after I lost my son, and had carried on to the extent where I was finding it very difficult to function, to do my daily activities in any way, and I wasn't really able to get any kind of routine back in my life, and I was really, really struggling with that constant, the impact of the flashbacks and things like that. Well, I'll talk about the symptoms in a minute of PTSD. But if it was stopping me from moving forward in any way, that would have been probably quite, problematic, and I may have felt that I need some medical help and support, and that might be from my GP, it might be, counselling, perhaps, so along those professional lines there. So some of the symptoms of PTSD are flashbacks, and that's something I experienced. Nightmares, that's something that can happen as well. You can, wake up in the middle of the night, back there. Something that I didn't experience that. I didn't experience any kind of intrusion that I know of at night. I didn't experience that. Hypervigilant or hyperarousal can be a symptom as well, where you might feel completely on edge, quite jumpy at the slightest sound, perhaps. That's something that can happen. The only thing I could say about that is, those of you who have ever heard a heart monitor when one of their loved ones may be hooked up to one might understand what I mean. When I say you get those beep sounds, if I ever hear that in a drama on TV or anywhere else, that can have quite a startled effect on me, because I'm back to the situation where I'm, on video cam, on video call with my son, because it was during lockdown that he was in hospital, and we weren't able to visit him, and we were on extensive video calls with each other. So that sound of the beep sound, and you'll know, as I say, you'll know if you ever heard it, it's something that you probably won't ever forget. I certainly won't. That can have a bit of a triggering effect on me. So I would say that would sound. Avoidance. You might completely avoid that location where whatever it was happened. You might, and we certainly do that, because that was in our, this happened in our local park, which is, a 10-minute walk from where we live, and we've never set foot in that park since then, and I don't think we ever will. So avoidance, you avoid those situations. You might avoid people. You might avoid certain people that remind you or bring you closer to that time. You might do that, so you might avoid that. Other than that, you might feel withdrawn, you might isolate yourself, and then with that you might have difficulty in concentrating, because if you're having all these intrusive kind of thoughts, you might then find it quite difficult to concentrate on every sort of everyday life, and you might have that dissociation where you're not really tuned in with the world around you. You're in a distant place somewhere else. So you might feel like that. People who work with trauma patients can also experience emotional fatigue, because they're listening to someone who's sharing their stories, perhaps, and that's sort of secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. So you might be listening to someone else's traumatic story, and that has an impact on you. All right, so that's also something that happens. So that's my experience of it. My experience was, thankfully, that my symptoms didn't go on too long, and not with the intensity where it was stopping me from doing the things I need to do or affecting my relationships. And when it gets to a point where it's doing that, it's you can't function with day-to-day living, or it begins to really affect your relationships at work, at home, in other situations, it can become a problem. And you may then think, or someone else may point it out to you that you possibly need some professional help there. Okay. If I talk about situation that a client shared with me, and this was some time ago, because I've been counselling women who have experienced child loss for the last 3.5 years now. And although I can't obviously share any specific story, but I can generalize and share generally what was going on. So I had a client who lost her son very sadly. They were living in America. Her son was in a different state to her and was studying and working. And he really wanted to prove it to his parents. I think he was in his mid to late 20s. He wanted to prove to his parents that he could, make it on his own, and he was, and that was, what he was doing. He very sadly lost his job at one point. This is all things that she got to know afterwards, after she sadly lost him. Lost his job. She did speak to him on the phone. She was in a different state, as I said, to him. And he said, he said that everything's fine. He didn't share that he had lost his job. Then later on, she called him, and he wasn't actually feeling very well, and so she was worried about him. And he said, well, no, there's nothing to worry about. I'll get myself off to the doctor, and we'll get it all sorted out. And she said, oh, you do have your health insurance is in place, isn't it? And he said, oh, yes, of course it is. Although it had run out, and he was financially struggling because he had lost his job. He wasn't attending university either, and she had no knowledge of this at all. He very sadly got very sick and passed away. Now, the thing is that when something like this happens, and you are left in a situation where you're trying to build a picture in your mind about what happened to my child, and my child was on their own, in those final moments, and that can have quite a detrimental effect on you mentally. I can understand that. What happened with her is that she built this story, this narrative, and she visualized how things might have been. That brought her a lot of trauma. To the extent where she couldn't sleep at night. She was having nightmares. There was a lot of those symptoms that I've just explained in PTSD, and this went on for some time. So she did eventually seek help from her family doctor, and she's on medication for that. So it's something that can affect some of us in ways that it's out of our control. But yeah, the thing is that it doesn't have to be. When it comes to trauma and symptoms of PTSD, it doesn't mean to, because we sort of associate PTSD with people in the armed forces, or people who have lived, lived through wars, perhaps. And we now, sort of realize that no, that it's more prevalent than that. And, there's, as I say, secondary trauma and vicarious, that can be referred to as vicarious trauma as well. Okay, in all sorts of ways. If you're in a job where you're dealing with people who are traumatized in any way, that can affect you. I myself, as I work with support women who have experienced child loss, and sometimes it can be in horrific ways. It can be a child who's very sadly been murdered, and And I can understand how I could quite easily be, take some of that trauma away from, not away from, but with, I can take some of that trauma, and have it as a secondary trauma from what my client has shared with me. So it can happen. I hope this video has been of help to you. I wanted to express a little bit about the difference between actual PTSD, as it is a mental health condition, and you can experience some of those symptoms. And it depends on how long those symptoms go on and how persistent they are, how intrusive they are, the severity of those symptoms, to whether you would then think about maybe seeking professional support. Okay. So thank you. Please comment if you're experiencing any kind of symptoms that I've talked about in this video. Please do that. Please share, like, and subscribe. Again, my goal is to build a community here where we can support one another, especially for that person who is, very much on their own, grieving, because of a loss. And and I'd just like to give that message out that, you're not alone. If only you just reach out, you'll find that there's lots of people, experiencing very similar things to yourself. And, we can maybe, hold out our hand to each other. And that's really what this is about. So thank you so much for listening. Please come by again. Until the next video, thank you. Please take care of yourselves.